In this 11th lecture in our series, we discuss the theory of Sigmund Freud. Freud was born on May 6, 1856. This was the same time that Marx was living at Dean Street in London. So that makes Freud 38 years younger than Marx. They never met, but they had a magnificent dialogue, a profound dialogue on the nature of human nature that includes many of the topics that we discussed in the last lecture. Work, for example. Marx and Freud in this dialogue offer perhaps the two great contrasting philosophies of the modern period. Yet before we trace these contrasts, and the contrast will be the subject of our lecture, we must note their similarities. Both were born in the 19th century into Jewish families with strong Judaic traditions, and yet both distanced themselves from that tradition and eventually offered powerful critiques of all religion. Freud scorned religion as a pathetic, infantile neurosis. He uses the strongest possible language in Civilization and Its Discontents. And he would have agreed with Marx's famous characterization of religion, that religion is the opium of the masses. Both Marx and Freud were heavily influenced by Germanic culture. Marx, as we saw, was educated at the universities of Bonn and Berlin. Freud grew up in Vienna, Austria, and was educated at the University of Vienna. Both then wrote their original work in German, and they saw themselves as part of that rich tradition of ideas. And yet both viewed their own philosophies as highly original, as expounding new scientific theories of human nature in society. Freud was, of course, a physician, and he had a claim to science, a strong one. But Marx also believed that he was a social scientist and spoke often about how his philosophy of history had a strong scientific empirical base. So both of them then appealed strongly to the idea, the aura, the ideal of science. And finally, though, for all their claims to science, both their philosophies are inspired with a deeply moralistic view of humanity. They are both visionaries in their deeply different ways, both moral prophets, we might say, as passionate as the great Hebraic biblical prophets of old that I mentioned in the last lecture on Marx. The first great contrast between Marx and Freud is with their attitude towards humanity, an attitude that carries over to their perspectives on history. Marx, as we saw, was profoundly an optimist. He believed that however alienated we are now, and of course we are profoundly alienated, nevertheless a bright new dawn is coming with communism. The end of all alienation then is just around the corner, after a class struggle. I smile at that point because I was reminded of it by a member of the audience, and that should testify to the fact that I do learn from these question and answer sessions that follow each one of these lectures, and I wish that all of you and our listening audience could be a part of those as well. Marx envisaged then as an idealist and an optimist a new class-less society. Freud, on the other hand, is deeply pessimistic. And one thing that strikes me about Freud is that he repeatedly calls himself a pessimist. That is, it's often the case that people are pessimistic, but if you confront them and say, well, you're really not pessimistic, they'll say, no, of course I'm not pessimistic. It's such a pejorative term. But Freud is right up front and says, yes, I am a pessimist. And he believes that life is, from a pessimistic point of view, inevitably, inexorably filled with pain, lots of it. That suffering is overwhelming. Unhappiness is far, far easier to obtain than happiness. And that in the future, we're likely to have more and more of the same, that is, unhappiness. There is no bright new dawn. There is only continuing darkness and we must face up to it. Now, this grim tale begins with his analysis of the human personality. Like Marx, he has a theory of human nature that sets forth a conception of the self divided in three parts. This notion of the three-part or tripartite self goes back to Plato. It actually, as you remember from our very first lecture, goes back to the Hindus. But it was Plato in the Western tradition that set it forth most forcefully, recall, and that is that every self, every psyche, every personality has three parts from Plato's point of view. First, intelligence, intellect, wisdom, and then second, spirit or courage, and then third, desire or appetite. Marx, as we saw last lecture, has the concept of the tripartite self and the natural man, the alienated man, and the species self or species being. Well, Freud has his own conception of the tripartite self to counter Marx's. And the conception, as you probably know because the language is so familiar to us, is that of the id, the ego, and the superego. As we look at each one of these theories, that is, as we will, the theory of the id, the theory of the ego, and the theory of the superego, we'll be contrasting implicitly or explicitly Marx's and Freud's theories. But overall, it seems to me, Marx's concern is with the cash nexus and how it impacts on each one of these selves or parts of the self. Whereas Freud's theory is with the, as I like to say, bash nexus, that is, the force is not of money but of aggression and a lust for aggression. Freud's theory, then, of the tripartite self is this. The first part is the id, which is defined by Freud as a bundle of instincts aiming only at gaining pleasure and avoiding pain. Unlike Marx, Freud believes then that this natural self is and always will be dominant, primarily because it exists as the unconscious part of our personality, and we can never know fully, never, even after 17 years of therapy. How many years has Woody Allen had now? I remember when he spoke last about his years of therapy, it was something like 17 or 18, but that was some time ago. We can have any amount of therapy, and we will still not be able to understand fully the depth of our unconscious self. That unconscious self, or the id, is represented above all by the forces, as I said, of aggression. It's the spoiled brat in our personality. It is endlessly demanding, it's impulsive, it's irrational, it's antisocial, it is selfish, it's pleasure-seeking, and it is not concerned at all, Freud emphasizes, with contradiction. That is, the ego, or the reasonable part of the personality, will say to the id, look, you can have, if you wish, because the id is all-powerful, you can have this or that, or perhaps you prefer that or those, and the id responds back, I want that and that and that and that, and I want it now. There is no sense of contradiction. I want it all. So the id, which can never possibly be fulfilled, is constantly making demands on our personality for more and more pleasure, that pain must be avoided. It wants it all. In the id, then, the instincts of sex and aggression are deeply fused. And as Freud got older, he stressed more the instinct of aggression, so that in his work that I want to focus on in a few moments, Civilization and Its Discontents, written in 1929, that work is his magnum opus on human nature and society, civilization, as it applies especially to the concept of aggression. His personality theory, though, is perhaps expressed earliest and best in his new introductory lectures on psychoanalysis. So let's go to some of his own words about the id as he describes it. The id, he says, is the dark, inaccessible part of our personality. We call it a chaos, a cauldron full of seething excitations. It is filled with energy reaching it from the instincts, but it has no organization, no collective will, only a striving to bring about the satisfaction of the instinctual needs subject to the observance of the all-powerful pleasure principle. The logical laws of thought don't apply to the id. And this is true above all, as we said, of the law of contradiction. So contrary impulses exist side by side without canceling each other out or diminishing each other. The id knows then no judgment of moral value, no good, no evil. Instinctual cathexes or drives seeking discharge, that in our view is all there is to the id. Now that's Freud's then description of this most powerful part of our personality that exists in the unconscious. Now the second part of our self is the ego. And this term is invariably misleading because, at least on college campuses, and I think generally, we continually refer to a person as a big ego. Well, that connotes something about the ego that Freud did not intend, and that is that when an individual has an inflated view of herself or himself, that speaks to the power of the ego. In fact, the ego, in Freud's theory, is not at all proud and inflated. It's cautious. It's commonsensical. It tries to restrain both the id and the superego. If the id is guided as it is by the pleasure principle, then the ego follows the reality principle because it's turned outward or concerned with the external world of objective reality. If the id is the brat in our personality, the ego comes across as the wimp. That is, it's reasonable, it's modest, but it's above all weak relative to the other parts of the personality. Therefore, it is, at the end of the day, ineffective. It's incapable of containing the demands of the id, but also the demands of the superego. It struggles desperately to serve, as Freud says, three masters, by mediating between the wild and wishful world of the id and the restraints imposed by the superego and the external world. So the ego is, in Freud's terms, the broker, the negotiator, the conciliator, in a terrible position because without power. And so when the id makes its incessant and insatiable demands for sexual gratification or for total domination, then the ego attempts to assert its control. But in this task, the ego is always embattled and besieged, two words that Freud likes. Inevitably, then, at a terrible disadvantage because it lacks superior power. It tries to call out for help from the superego against the id, but it's usually punished for this by the superego. To take Freud's own words about the ego is, he says, invariably turned towards the external world. It's taken on the task of representing the external world to the id. Fortunately for the id, which would not escape destruction if in its blind efforts for the satisfaction of its instincts it disregarded that supreme external power of the outside world. The ego then is shaped by the reality principle. It stands for reason, for good sense, as opposed to the ids having stood for passion, the untamed passions of the self. Ego must, on the whole, carry out then the id's intentions, Freud says, and we're warned by a proverb against serving two masters at the same time. The poor ego has things even worse. It serves three severe masters and does what it can to bring their claims and demands into harmony with one another. Its three masters are then the external world, the superego, and the id. It tries to satisfy them simultaneously, or rather obey them simultaneously, and it's no wonder that it so often fails. It feels hemmed in on three sides, threatened by three kinds of danger, Freud says, to which, if it is hard-pressed, it reacts by generating more and more anxiety. Thus, the ego, driven by the id, confined by the superego, repulsed by reality, struggles to master its task of bringing about harmony among the forces and influences working in and upon it. And we can understand how it is that so often we cannot suppress a cry coming from our ego. Life is not easy. Well, this is the grim struggle going on, and therapy, if it is to serve a constructive purpose, tries to reinforce our egos, tries to strengthen then that sense of reason within us. But therapy is confronted not only by the id, which would be plenty by itself, it also has to face the third component of the personality, and that is the superego. The superego is like the id in one key respect. It's totally irrational. But in all other respects, it's unlike the id, and it represents the id's main adversary within us, the other source of the internal conflict that is irremediable in our incurably split self. The superego is more powerful than the ego, but it's certainly less powerful than the id. It's the preacher, the stern parent of ourself, that deals primarily in guilt and in setting impossible standards of moral perfection. Parents are responsible for the creation of the superego. Society is, of course, always in the background, shaping what we feel and what we think, but the parents have the first go at the kid. And the parents then instill these feelings of guilt and what Freud calls the ego ideal, that is, standards of impossible perfection. We look on our children and we know that they can get not just an A average, but an A+ average in school. We know that they can score perfectly on the standardized tests, the SATs and the LSATs and the MCATs and all the others, because they are, after all, perfect. And we know that after they graduate from school, they will be able to make their mark in society, and history will wonder at them because, after all, they are our children. And so as we put that on our kids, they internalize those impossible expectations, and that is the ego ideal. So if the superego has these two parts, the conscience representing guilt on the one hand, and the ego ideal representing the impossible idealized expectations, these two parts are at one another as the carrot and stick in the personality. And in Freud's theory, the superego then manages to punish as well as to reward. If you strive to meet the unreasonable, the unreachable expectations imposed on you by your parents, then you will be in the state of constant pain and alienation that Freud sees as necessary. In these respects, then, the superego must, because it induces so much pain and suffering in trying to meet these expectations, must oppose the pleasure principle and the reality principle of the ego as well, always trying to enforce its own morality because it represents the morality principle. It represents, as Freud will say later in Civilization is Discontents, the force of the giant superego of civilization, and especially of religion. So with this analysis then of human nature, we approach Freud's main treatise of social theory, and that is Civilization and its Discontents. The original title, and I think the original is perhaps less poetic but better, was simply Unhappiness in Civilization. That's a more direct title because it is a book about the sources of our unhappiness. And once again, to Freud's credit as a theorist, he can write so much about unhappiness and still be a bestseller, as it has been repeatedly in psychoanalytic theory. It's an attempt, an honest attempt, to diagnose, as a physician might, the sources of suffering. And it's diagnosed on a grand scale. In the opening chapters of Civilization and its Discontents, Freud examines the sources of our pain and how we struggle most ineffectively to cope with this pain. And I think that these are among the most powerful passages. He begins by saying, life as we find it is too hard for us. He likes that line. He keeps coming back to it. Life is so hard. It brings us so many pains, so many disappointments, and impossible tasks. We're threatened in life with suffering from three directions. First, from our own body, which is doomed to decay and dissolution. Second, from the external world, which rages against us with overwhelming and merciless forces of destruction. And finally, from our relations to other people. The suffering which comes from this last source, from interpersonal relations, is perhaps more painful to us than any other. We tend to regard it as a kind of gratuitous addition, although it cannot be any less fatefully inevitable than the suffering which comes from elsewhere. It's this third source of suffering coming from personal relationships, their pain, the failure of personal relationships, that concerns Freud most. He says of this third form of suffering that we do not admit it at all. We cannot see why the regulations made by ourselves should not, on the contrary, be a protection and a benefit for every one of us. And yet, when we consider how unsuccessful we have been in precisely this field of prevention of suffering, a suspicion dawns on us that here, too, a piece of unconquerable nature may lie behind, this time a piece of our own psychical constitution. Let's review this theory where we're at now, because we want to get the full force of the pessimism and make sure that we have the thrust of Freud's theory. The personality theory itself is deeply pessimistic because we are, as we saw, locked into a state of psychic alienation from which we cannot possibly escape. We're not even aware of the depth of our unconscious. And so we cannot solve this continuing struggle between the id and the superego, not to speak of the struggle between the ego, the forces of reason, and the superego or the id. So that alienation, that split self is, and this is the term that Freud repeatedly uses, irremediable. There is no quick fix, there is no drug, there is no medical treatment of any kind to solve this basic psychic alienation. We are caught in this split self. And as we fight this pain, the one insisting on maximum pleasure, the other insisting on the repression of that pleasure, we are inevitably doomed to suffering. Now, given that basic problem, that our own personalities are working emphatically and dramatically against us, that problem is complicated by the nature of the world at large, in which we are necessarily put. And the nature of the world imposes on us, Freud says, three distinct forms of suffering. And note again what they are. I'm so impressed by the fact that Freud, who is at this time suffering from cancer of the mouth and jaw, and as his doctor Max Schur, who was with him throughout the last 12 years of his life, indicates that now in 1929, Freud, a heroic type, suffering from the pain of cancer, will not take drugs himself except for aspirin in order to relieve the pain. He's suffering from the dissolution of his body, the first form of suffering that he points to. He can say that this is not the worst form of suffering that we have. That is, we are threatened with suffering from our own body, doomed to decay and dissolution, but as he is experiencing the decay and dissolution, he is not saying this is the worst. The second type is not the worst either. The second is fate, as he says, the slings and arrows from the external world which rage against us with overwhelming and merciless forces of destruction. That is, the forces in that outside world that we encounter necessarily the outrageous fortune of that world. If the slings and arrows were not enough, combined with a necessary physical dissolution, the third form of suffering, he says, is the worst. And that's what he's concerned with most. And that is the interpersonal form of suffering. The suffering that we cause one another necessarily and inevitably. That's the source of the most excruciating pain. And as we reflect on our, Freud says, inability to resolve this problem that we cause so much pain to one another, that kind of pain, that kind of suffering, dramatically portrayed in the example of Kitty Genovese that I mentioned last time, the ruthless, aggressive nature of ourselves, but portrayed in any number of cases. And on my mind now is the horrific case of child abuse that happened in New York City just recently by Elisa Izquierdo, 6 years old, and her mother tortured her and then killed her. Allegedly, she hasn't been convicted of the crime, but it seems so. At 6 years of age, recalling the earlier case of Lisa Steinberg. Remember in 1987, the young 6-year-old who was killed by her father. Now, these dramatic examples are only the tip of the iceberg. Freud is not speaking of the episodes that get written up on the front page of the New York Times. Freud is talking about the ongoing, inevitable nature of the way in which we cause pain among ourselves in our most intimate interactions. Pain that occurs among loved ones. And as that pain is inflicted in an argument, in a dispute, in a cruel remark, we often say immediately after, God, how could I have said that? But I won't say it again. And then sure enough, the same kind of comment appears the day or the week or the month later. And so we go to the sorest spot of that person's personality and rub the salt in. Now, how is it that we've learned how to do that so well? So that one kind of relationship will fall to another kind of relationship, to another, and they'll all be characterized by that mutual sense of cruelty and destructiveness. That's Freud's problem. And his answer is that the reason for this is that in our unconscious we want to hurt other people desperately. And it's not just that we want to hurt them, we get pleasure, immense pleasure, from inflicting pain on others. We will not admit that to ourselves. If we admit it to ourselves at all, then we'll be punished by the superego, by the guilt, forces of guilt and the ego ideal. But as we come to terms with this, after one relationship after another fails, then we have to conclude with Freud that this is a piece of our own psychical constitution, a piece of our own psychical constitution deeply buried there. We cannot escape it any more than we can escape the physical decay that accompanies our physical constitution. Faced with this degree of suffering, this inevitable suffering that we cannot then elude, we try desperately to cope with life's pains. And Freud, in the beginning of Civilization's Discontents, quite movingly, I think, tries to give us his view of the coping mechanisms, the pathetic coping mechanisms that we generate to cope with our life's problems, with the pain, with the suffering all around us. Now, these three ways of individual coping begin with intoxication. Intoxication of drugs. Intoxication of all kinds of drugs. This is the crudest, Freud says, and the most physically injurious way of hurting ourselves. And Freud, after mentioning that as a coping mechanism, as one of the most effective coping mechanisms for a short period of time, then moves on to say, well, that clearly can't be a solution. It can only be another problem. So the second is that Freud says of isolation. We can try to remove ourselves from all these people that are causing the pain. And Freud says that historically this has been generated as the solution in India, for example, who advocates, remember in the first lecture, the ideal of vanaprastha, which means literally forest hermit. One goes off away from one's family to the forest and tries to discover the truth. Freud says there's a reason for this. We flee to the forest because we're trying to get away from all that pain. And hopefully in the forest, in a state of isolation, we will be able then to kill the basic instincts. That is, no sex. We will not be able to gorge ourselves on food. We will then limit the way in which these instincts can cry out to us for satisfaction. This killing of the instincts that Freud finds then in Eastern religions, as he says, is one way of solving the problem. We don't want to experience the excruciating agony of a love relationship. We remove all possible love objects, all possibility of sex, and therefore kill that instinct as far as it can be. But of course it can't be. It's repressed, and from Freud's point of view, will constantly then reassert itself, so that's no solution. Anyway, even if it were possible to kill the instinct, we would be killing a large part of our humanity. Is that the way we want to live, in a state of isolation? But we're stuck. There's a double bind. We must live in society, most of us, but in living in society, we're doomed to continual suffering. It's society that causes the problem. Now, the last of the coping mechanisms is the one that Freud spends most time on, that is sublimation. A sublimation, which means, from Freud's point of view, the expression of a powerful, aggressive, destructive impulse, somehow in a way that is socially acceptable. So we take socially unacceptable instincts and we express them in acceptable ways. Obviously, the kind of example that comes to mind is sports. An individual really wants to take a baseball bat, find his nearest enemy, and club him over the head with it. But instead of that, he goes onto a sports field, hits a home run, a grand slam in a World Series game, ideally, perfectly, and he gets immense satisfaction from that. Now that is sublimation, and it occurs in a variety of forms. Love is a form of sublimation. What really is the root of love? Clearly, lust. That is the aggressive desire to satisfy oneself. Lust in the form of domination and rape and all of the rest. That's what we identify with clearly with the instinct of the libido. But what do? We turn it into the form of romantic love. And romantic love then idealizes a basic instinct which is socially unacceptable. Romantic love then becomes sublimation. In each of these cases, when we talk about sublimation, Freud says, we have a basic instinct that demands satisfaction. It's socially unacceptable. We find a way to make it socially acceptable. But, the big but is, in making it socially acceptable, we do not ever get the same form of satisfaction that we would get out of directly satisfying that impulse. Nothing can possibly satisfy us more than taking the baseball bat and clubbing somebody over the head with it if he's their worst enemy. Not even going into the arena, the stadium, and hitting that Grand Slam home run. The basic truth is this, that satisfaction of the primal instincts, of the aggressive instincts, is what we want. We sublimate. Work is another form of sublimation. We take our aggressive desire to dominate others and we turn it into a socially acceptable form. And Freud says that in some cases, that socially acceptable form of professional activity, perhaps a successful artist or a successful scientist, that socially acceptable form will be highly satisfying. But it can never be as satisfying as the direct satisfaction of that primal impulse. And even then, it is, Freud says, that kind of work open to only a few. That is, how many creative scientists or artists or people extremely successful in their professional activity can there be? For the most part, work is, Freud's point, direct opposition to Marx, seen as a plague and to be avoided like the plague. Most people, Freud says, are lazy and they do not want to work, and that is because they cannot sublimate through their work satisfactorily. So Freud is directly opposite from Marx on this point. He argues that, sure, there are cases of people getting a great deal from their work, but those people are few and far between. What we see for the most part, a vast humanity that is unsatisfied through its work, that is lazy, that wants then satisfaction through domination, but cannot find any way to dominate. For most people, the majority then, the ways of handling aggression in terms of these coping mechanisms are woefully unsuccessful. Aggression, therefore, spills into awesome violence and terrible unhappiness as a result of this violence. That is, in warfare, in revolt, in all of the aspects of the larger society that Freud now diagnoses when he turns from the micro to the macro. The micro is the individual, remember, on the couch, struggling to satisfy in some way, through sublimation, through intoxication, through love relationships, whatever, struggling to satisfy his demands for pleasure, his aggressive impulses. He fails to do this. Now, when enough individuals get together failing to do this, then it's expressed in macro form of a whole culture being terribly unhappy, unfulfilled, and above all, wanting to aggress on each other, on anyone around who seems that they can safely aggress on. So we move then Freud in Civilization's Discontents. I think this is the hallmark of his theory in the sense that he becomes a social and a political theorist at this point. He moves, we might say, from the couch to the culture, from the analysis of the individual, the micro, on the couch, to the analysis of a whole civilization in a state of profound discontent. At this point, we can clearly raise the question, is this legitimate? Can we move from the analysis of a person, even if he is right about his theory of the unconscious and the rest of the aspects of the personality, can we make this leap from the micro to the macro? And I think that's a legitimate question. But Freud makes it in Civilization's Discontents. In Chapter 5 especially, he insists that these truths that are set forth in a visual sense can also apply to a large group of individuals in a macro sense. And we have now the mass id in the majority of people demanding satisfaction, lusting for aggression and domination, and the mass of the moral codes in society, that is the large macro civilization representing the superego or the mass superego. We have then these two impulses, mass impulses vying with each other. The destructive, pleasure-seeking impulses of the mass of humanity against the moral codes of civilization and society, represented, as I said, in ethical systems and in religion. We are necessarily locked into this contest. And remember the basic theory, and that is that both of these forces of the mass id and the micro civilization, the macro superego rather, both of these forces are necessarily irrational. It's not that civilization is somehow going to save us from the aggressive instincts of humankind. So Freud represents then the voice of civilization in this sense, especially of religion. The great world religions have set forth in the same irrational voice as the superego impossible expectations, calls to conscience. Freud, I think, is at his best when he is deriding religion for setting forth utopian demands that cannot possibly be fulfilled, like love thy neighbor and love thine enemy. He takes these and analyzes them with a ruthless spirit of diagnosis, saying how, given our personalities, these could not conceivably succeed. But when the collective superego of civilization gives these commands, then to love thine enemy and love thy neighbor, the id screams back, not love thy neighbor, but kill him and love his wife instead, or rather rape the whole neighborhood. That's what the id speaks. And as it speaks that forth, as we often say, love thy neighbor but not thy neighbor's wife, that kind of adage, it speaks to the fact that Freud is right here, that it's an impossible dictum to set forth. And so he generalizes about the aggressive nature of the human species in clear and direct terms. This is what our most powerful force, the id, tells us. The element of truth behind, then, all of my theory, he says in Civilization's Discontents, which people are so ready to disavow, is that men are not gentle creatures who want to be loved, and who at the most can defend themselves if they are attacked. They are, on the contrary, creatures among whose instinctual endowments is to be reckoned a powerful share of aggressiveness. As a result, their neighbor is for them not only a sexual object, but also someone who tempts them to satisfy their aggressiveness on him, to exploit his capacity for work without compensation, to use him sexually without his consent, to seize his possessions, to humiliate him, to cause him pain, to torture and to kill him. Homo homini lupus. Man is a wolf to man. Well, there can be no more powerful and direct indictment of humanity than that. And that is the source of the pessimism. We are wolves to one another. I think it does a certain disservice to wolves. As a matter of fact, with the latest research that we know about wolves, they seem to be more benign than we had thought, maybe more benign than humanity. But at the time of this expression of Plutarch's, Homo homini lupus, it seemed as though we were vying a state of mutual aggressiveness. We have then this problem. And the problem is that while we idealize humanity, the very term humanity, in fact, humans are cruel and brutal, and warfare suggests the truth of that. Now, among the many conspirators or idealists who try to undermine this truth is Marx. And Freud has implicitly been arguing against Marx all the time, but now, at the end of Civilization's Discontents, he comes right to the point, and that is, he says, Marx, you are responsible for a lot of this by saying that we are all basically benign. If only the institution of private property were removed, we'd be able to enjoy a noble and a sinless life. Freud says, far from it. In abolishing private property, we deprive, if we could, the human love of aggression of one of its instruments. Private property is the means through which we express our aggression, and if we should be able to eliminate private property, we would find other means to register that aggression. Aggressiveness was not created by property. It reigned almost without limit in primitive times, when property was still very, very scanty. In fact, this is the truth. Aggression must form the basis of every relation of affection and love among people. Marx will not see that. It is always, he says, possible to bind together a considerable number of people in apparent love. And here he's certainly thinking of the emerging Nazi Reich. So long, he says, as there are other people left over to receive the manifestations of their aggressiveness. That is, it's all well and good to bind people in an erotic embrace of nationalism, so long as you have individuals around who will be scapegoats and they can take their aggression out. And here he comes, I think, to a moving part of Civilization's Discontents when he concludes, in this respect, the Jewish people, scattered everywhere, have rendered most useful services to the civilizations of the communities that have been their hosts. But unfortunately, all the massacres of Jews in the Middle Ages did not suffice to make that period more peaceful and secure for their Christian fellows. A bitter, a sardonic comment on the services that the Jews have performed. We might surely say that Freud, who died in 1939 and could not have seen the concentration camps, would at least not have been surprised by Auschwitz. Freud would have seen that monstrous inhumanity and saw that it wasn't really inhumanity at all. It was humanity in its truest and most direct sense. And that is the indictment of humankind, with which we are stuck, which we now face. It's an indictment that says this: above all, be honest to ourselves, and then at least we will not be surprised by another Holocaust.